Hello, and welcome back to the Sleepy Inventory channel. Tonight's object is something small, something thin and light, folded or flat, probably somewhere within reach of you right now, in a wallet, a pocket, a drawer, a handbag. You have touched one today, probably more than once. You handed it to someone or someone handed it to you, and neither of you thought about it for more than a second before it passed from one hand to the next and kept moving on its way. A banknote. A thin rectangle of something that feels like paper but isn't, printed with faces and numbers and symbols you have never looked at closely enough to understand. It is, in some ways, the most ordinary object in the world, and in other ways, it is one of the strangest things you own. So settle in, there's no rush. The story takes its time, and tonight, without needing to do anything at all, you will learn more than you ever expected about a thing you thought you already knew. The banknote in your wallet is older than most countries. The idea it represents is more than 1,000 years old. The physical object itself, the piece of printed material you might have touched 5 minutes ago, is not made from what you think it is, carries symbols that nobody has fully explained, glows under lights you cannot see with your naked eye, and has survived empires, revolutions, and the collapse of entire economies. It is also, on average, extremely dirty, but we will come to that. The story of paper money does not begin in Europe. It does not begin with any of the faces printed on the currency you might be carrying. It begins in China, more than 1,000 years ago, in a dynasty most people in the Western world have never spent much time thinking about. It was the Tang dynasty, somewhere around the 7th century. China at that time was the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. It had cities so large that nothing in Europe would match them for another 800 years. It had trade networks that stretched from the Pacific coast across continents toward the Mediterranean. It had a bureaucracy of astonishing complexity, administering a state that operated on a scale Europeans at the time could barely imagine. And in this world of complex commerce, a problem had quietly emerged. Metal coins were heavy. This sounds like a small problem, but consider what it meant in practice. A merchant traveling between cities, carrying enough copper coins to conduct serious business, was carrying an enormous amount of weight. The coins clinked and shifted in bags. They slowed horses and carts. They made merchants targets for thieves. The more successful your business, the heavier your burden became. For long-distance trade in a country the size of China, moving the money could become a bigger problem than finding the buyers. The solution was elegant. Merchants began leaving their coins with trusted deposit shops in major cities, receiving in return a piece of paper, a receipt, a promise. The paper said, in effect, "This person has deposited a certain amount of coins and is entitled to collect them on demand." These receipts began to circulate. Rather than returning to the deposit shop to collect coins and then hand them to someone else, merchants simply handed over the paper. The paper was the money. Or rather, the paper represented the money, which was held somewhere safe and heavy and did not need to be carried at all. The Tang government eventually formalized this system. By the time of the Song dynasty in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Chinese state was issuing official paper currency on a significant scale. These notes were printed on a special material made from the bark of mulberry trees, which is strong, distinctive, and difficult to replicate. They bore official seals and serial numbers. They had expiration dates. They were, in almost every meaningful sense, recognizably modern. The Song government introduced something called jiaozi, widely considered the world's first genuine state-issued paper currency. The administration of this currency became a sophisticated bureaucratic enterprise with dedicated printing bureaus, regional distribution systems, and complex rules about how and when notes could be exchanged. When the system worked, it worked remarkably well. When it failed, as it periodically did, it prefigured almost every paper currency crisis that would follow in Europe many centuries later. Marco Polo arrived in China in the 13th century and encountered this system with something close to astonishment. His account of it, when he returned to Europe, was met with disbelief. The idea that a piece of paper could function as money seemed almost impossible to European observers still hauling heavy coins in leather pouches. Polo wrote that the paper was issued under such authority and solemnity that it served as a perfect tender of payment throughout the empire. Readers in Venice largely treated this as an exotic curiosity rather than a practical model. Europe took several more centuries to catch up. The first European banknotes appeared in Sweden in 1661, issued by a bank called Stockholm's Banco. The bank had been accepting deposits of copper coins, since copper was the metal Sweden happened to have in abundance, though it was heavy and inconvenient in large quantities, and issuing paper receipts in return. When the bank began issuing more receipts than it had copper to back them, it became the first European institution to experience a modern bank run, and it eventually collapsed. The idea, however, had taken hold. The Bank of England began issuing notes in 1694. The first Bank of England notes were handwritten, signed individually by a cashier, and made out to a specific named individual. They looked nothing like the standardized printed notes carried today. They were closer to personalized letters of credit, formal documents that happened to function as money. For nearly 2 centuries, Bank of England notes remained partially handwritten, with a cashier adding specific details by pen until the process was fully mechanized only in the early 20th century. The transition from coins to paper was not smooth. People were suspicious of paper money in a way that is easy to understand if you think about what it actually is. A piece of printed material whose value depends entirely on a shared agreement. Coins had intrinsic value. The metal in a gold coin was worth something regardless of what was stamped on it. A paper note was worth only as much as the institution behind it was trusted to honor it. And institutions, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, are not always trustworthy. This suspicion turned out to be well-founded. The history of paper money is also, inevitably, a history of paper money going wrong, of governments printing more notes than they had backing for, of currencies collapsing, of the strange and destructive thing that happens when money loses its meaning. The French Revolution provided one of the earliest European examples. The revolutionary government issued a paper currency called the assignat, originally backed by confiscated church lands. Within a few years, vastly more assignats had been printed than the underlying land could support, and the currency lost essentially all its value. By the late 1790s, the assignat was worth so little that bundles of it were used as wallpaper, kindling, and cigarette paper, a pattern that would repeat itself more dramatically in other countries in the centuries that followed. The most dramatic example in modern history occurred in Germany in the early 1920s. Germany had lost the First World War. Under the Treaty of Versailles, it was required to pay enormous reparations to the Allied powers. The German economy was already badly damaged. The government, faced with debts it could not pay through conventional means, made a decision that appeared, at first, to offer a temporary solution. It began printing money. Initially, this produced some economic activity. More money in circulation meant more spending, which meant more apparent prosperity. But the underlying problem did not go away. The money was not backed by anything real. There was no actual wealth being created to justify the volume of notes being printed, and once the process was underway, it became very difficult to stop. By 1923, the German mark had collapsed so completely that the figures involved become almost impossible to process. At the peak of the hyperinflation, prices were doubling every few days. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they lost value. People carried money in wheelbarrows, not because they were wealthy, but because a wheelbarrow full of banknotes might purchase a loaf of bread if they reached the shop before the price changed again. Restaurants stopped printing menus because prices changed faster than menus could be updated. A cup of coffee might cost one price when ordered and a higher price by the time it was finished. Postage stamps issued at one value in the morning were reissued at 10 times that value by the afternoon, and the banknotes themselves, as physical objects, began to serve purposes nobody had anticipated. They became essentially worthless as instruments of exchange, while paradoxically becoming useful as something else entirely. People burned them for heat because a bundle of banknotes generated more warmth than the coal or wood the same notes would have purchased. Some people wallpapered their homes with them, not as a gesture, but as a practical measure. The paper was abundant and worth more as insulation than as currency. Children played with stacks of million-mark notes as they might have played with blocks in other times and places. The hyperinflation ended when a new currency, the Rentenmark, was introduced, backed by land rather than gold, with the government committed to printing no more than the economy could support. The psychological damage lasted far longer. The generation of Germans who lived through 1923 never entirely trusted paper money again, and historians have argued that the memory of that period shaped German economic policy and attitudes toward inflation for the rest of the 20th century. Hyperinflation did not stop there. Hungary experienced the worst hyperinflation ever recorded in 1945 and 1946, when the pengo collapsed so completely that the government eventually had to issue a note denominated at 100 quintillion pengo, a 1 followed by 20 zeros. The largest denomination banknote ever officially printed. Zimbabwe in the late 2000s issued a $100 trillion note, which at the peak of inflation was worth approximately 40 US cents. These notes are now collected as curiosities, souvenirs of what happens when paper money loses its relationship with everything paper money is supposed to represent. The history of counterfeiting runs almost as long as the history of paper money itself. As soon as notes existed, people began attempting to copy them. The incentive is obvious. Produce something sufficiently convincing, and you can spend it as genuine. Unlike counterfeiting coins, which required access to metal and casting equipment, counterfeiting paper required, in theory, nothing beyond paper, ink, and enough skill to produce a convincing reproduction. Governments have consistently treated counterfeiting as among the most serious of crimes. In medieval England, it was classified as high treason, punishable by death. The Continental Congress during the American Revolution declared counterfeiting of continental currency punishable by death. The British, during that same conflict, organized a deliberate campaign of counterfeiting continental notes, flooding the colonies with fakes in an attempt to destroy the American economy's ability to finance the war. The operation came close to succeeding. By the end of the war, continental currency had lost so much of its value that the phrase "not worth a continental" entered the American vocabulary and stayed there for more than a century. The most ambitious counterfeiting effort in modern history was organized by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. Operation Bernhard involved forcing concentration camp prisoners, many of them professional engravers, printers, and document forgers, to produce counterfeit British pounds of sufficient quality that they were nearly impossible to distinguish from genuine notes. The intention was to flood Britain with fake currency and destabilize the British economy from within. The notes produced under Operation Bernhard were of extraordinary quality. British intelligence was aware of the operation, but could not entirely stop it. Some of the counterfeit notes were used by German intelligence to pay agents and finance operations abroad. Others were dumped into Austrian lakes near the end of the war, where they remained for decades, occasionally surfacing when retrieved by fishermen who had no idea what they had found. Some of those notes, authenticated as Operation Bernhard forgeries, are now collected as historical artifacts and are worth considerably more than their original face value. Which brings us, by a path nobody in Tang Dynasty China could have anticipated, to the strange question of what exactly a banknote is actually made of. Most people assume, reasonably enough, that banknotes are made of paper. They feel like paper. They are thin and flexible and produce a similar sound when handled. They are not, however, paper. Not precisely. Most banknotes in circulation around the world are made from a mixture of cotton and linen fibers. In the United States, the formula is 75% cotton and 25% linen. No wood pulp is involved, which is the critical distinction from ordinary paper. Wood pulp paper, the kind used in books and notebooks and printer paper, contains a substance called lignin, which degrades over time and causes paper to yellow and become brittle. Cotton and linen fibers contain no lignin. They are stronger, more flexible, and significantly more durable. This explains why a banknote that passes through a washing machine emerges intact, damp, and perhaps slightly creased, but structurally undamaged. Ordinary paper would not survive the same treatment. The cotton-linen blend persists because its fibers are tougher and more tightly interlocked than wood pulp fibers, and because the inks used to print currency are formulated to bond with those fibers rather than simply resting on the surface. Heat is a different matter. The inks on banknotes, while water-resistant, are sensitive to high temperatures. A banknote left in a hot dryer can lose its printing. A banknote left on a radiator can discolor. A banknote exposed to direct flame, obviously, will burn, though it often burns in a particular way, because the cotton-linen blend chars rather than flames, smoldering slowly from the edges inward. The texture of a banknote, that slightly rough, faintly waxy feel that is immediately recognizable, comes from the printing process. Currency is produced using a technique called intaglio printing, in which ink is pressed into the note's surface from engraved plates under enormous pressure. The ink sits slightly raised from the surface of the note. If you run your finger across a genuine banknote with your eyes closed, you can feel the texture of the printed areas, the portrait, the numerals, certain design elements. This tactile quality is among the most difficult things to replicate convincingly in a counterfeit, and it functions as a deliberate security feature. The cotton-linen substrate is manufactured by a small number of highly specialized companies. In the United States, paper for Federal Reserve notes has been produced by a single supplier, Crane & Company, since 1879. The company uses a proprietary blend and manufacturing process, and the paper itself is classified as a security document. Obtaining genuine banknote paper through conventional means is, for practical purposes, impossible. This is one of the first lines of defense against counterfeiting. Even a counterfeiter with access to excellent printing equipment cannot easily replicate the correct substrate. Woven directly into the paper of most modern banknotes are security threads. Thin strips of plastic or metallic material incorporated during manufacturing. In U.S. currency, this takes the form of a plastic strip running vertically through the note. Held to the light, it appears as a thin, dark line from top to bottom. Printed along the thread in letters too small to read without magnification are the words USA 20, or whatever denomination the note represents, repeated along its full length. Threads in different denominations are positioned at different locations within the note, allowing the denomination to be verified at a glance simply by checking where the thread runs. The thread also fluoresces under ultraviolet light, with different denominations producing different colors. The $5 bill glows blue under UV. The 10 glows orange. The 20 glows green. The 50 glows yellow. The 100 glows pink. A UV light source of the type used in shops and casinos around the world can verify both the genuineness of a note and its denomination in a single check. The lifespan of a banknote varies considerably depending on denomination and how frequently it changes hands. A $1 bill, used constantly in small daily transactions, lasts on average around 6 years before it becomes too worn to remain in circulation. Higher denomination notes, handled less frequently and with more care, last considerably longer. A $100 bill averages approximately 15 years of active circulation. A $5 bill lasts about 5 years. A 50 lasts closer to 12. Notes that become too worn are collected by central banks and destroyed. In the United States, the Federal Reserve destroys roughly 4,000 metric tons of old currency annually. The destruction method is shredding, and the resulting material is sometimes recycled, used in compost, mixed into building insulation, or sold in small novelty bags by Federal Reserve banks as souvenirs. A small bag of shredded currency from the Federal Reserve gift shop contains, technically, several $100s in former banknotes, now worth nothing at all. Research into the microbial population of banknotes has produced findings that are, in certain respects, unsettling. Banknotes carry a substantial variety of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, and in some cases, viral particles. A 2017 study analyzing dollar bills in circulation in New York City found traces of nearly 3,000 distinct types of bacteria on the notes examined, including organisms associated with skin, oral cavities, and other, less pleasant sources. The warm, enclosed environment of a wallet or pocket is, it turns out, reasonably hospitable to microbial life. A separate body of research has identified traces of cocaine on a significant proportion of banknotes tested across multiple countries. This is not primarily because the notes were used directly in drug transactions. Cocaine powder is fine enough that once it enters the currency supply through any route, it spreads readily through normal handling, transferring from hand to hand and from note to note. Depending on the country and denomination, studies have found cocaine traces on anywhere from 40 to 90% of notes tested. The concentrations are far too small to have any physiological effect, and the presence of cocaine on a banknote is not evidence that the specific note was used in drug trade. It is simply evidence that the currency supply as a whole has been contaminated by a substance that spreads easily through ordinary handling. the thin rectangle handled so casually, dozens of times each day, carries considerably more than its face value suggests. Some countries have moved away from cotton linen entirely in favor of polymer, a form of plastic. Australia was the first to introduce polymer banknotes in 1988, and the technology has since been adopted by dozens of countries, including Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Singapore. Polymer notes last roughly 2.5 times longer than cotton linen equivalents. They are more resistant to water and dirt and more difficult to counterfeit because the plastic substrate accommodates security features that cannot be replicated in paper. They also feel different, slightly slippery, marginally cooler to the touch, with a specific crispness when folded that cotton linen notes do not produce. In countries that have switched, public resistance has occasionally followed, driven not by any functional objection, but by the unfamiliarity of the material. The relationship between a person and the physical currency they have carried throughout their life is, it appears, more tactile and more personal than it might seem from a distance. There are also banknotes made from materials stranger still. During the Second World War, when conventional paper was scarce in some regions, emergency currencies were printed on leather, silk, and even wood. In the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, postage stamps were printed with a message on the back declaring them valid as currency, turning stamps into miniature banknotes overnight. In wartime, France and Belgium, not geld, emergency money, was issued in remarkable variety, printed on whatever materials were available. The world's largest banknote ever issued was the Philippine 100,000 peso note, released in 1998 to commemorate the centennial of Philippine independence. It measures approximately 34 centimeters by 15 centimeters, closer to the size of a sheet of paper than to a conventional banknote. Only a small number were printed, and they are now valuable collector items. The world's smallest banknote ever issued was the Romanian 10 bani note from 1917, printed during the First World War. It measures about 27 millimeters by 38 millimeters, smaller than a modern postage stamp. It was designed to be small partly to save paper during wartime rationing, and partly because its low value did not warrant a larger, more expensive note. The most expensive banknote ever sold at auction was an 1,890 United States $1,000 Treasury note, known as the Grand Watermelon Note, because the large zeros on the back resemble the shape of watermelons. One example sold at auction in 2014 for more than $3 million. The number of these notes still in existence is extremely small, and each one is the object of considerable interest among collectors of early American currency. Some banknotes are famous for what is printed on them, not for how rare they are. The Zimbabwean $100 trillion note, issued at the peak of that country's hyperinflation, has become a globally recognized symbol of currency collapse. Despite its astronomical face value, an original example now sells for tens of dollars on the collector market. worth much more as a historical artifact than it ever was as money. The oldest banknote still surviving in physical form is a Chinese note from the Ming Dynasty dating to the 14th century. Examples are preserved in museums around the world. They are made from mulberry bark paper and are remarkable for being larger than a modern sheet of paper, printed with detailed black ink designs and red official seals. Holding one, or seeing one through a museum case, is holding a direct physical connection to the origins of paper money 700 years back, which brings us, at last, to the symbols. Turn a $1 bill face down. On the reverse, two circular designs appear side by side, separated by the word one in large letters. These are the two sides of the Great Seal of the United States, adopted by Congress in 1782 and incorporated into currency design in 1935. The left circle shows a pyramid. It is an unfinished pyramid, 13 courses of stone rising to a flat top, above which floats, detached and surrounded by rays of light, a single eye inside a triangle. This is the Eye of Providence, also called the All-Seeing Eye, a symbol used in Christian iconography for centuries to represent the watchful presence of God. Below the pyramid, in a ribbon, are the Latin words annuit coeptus, meaning approximately, he has favored our undertakings. Above the pyramid, in another ribbon, are the words Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. The combination of pyramid, eye, and Latin inscriptions has generated an extraordinary body of interpretation over the years, much of it involving secret societies, hidden codes, and conspiracies of various kinds. The Freemasons are the most commonly cited connection. The Eye of Providence does appear in Masonic iconography, and a significant number of the American founding fathers were Freemasons. This has produced the persistent argument that the Great Seal's imagery was chosen to encode Masonic symbolism permanently into the currency, a ubiquitous declaration of the secret brotherhood's influence over the founding of the nation. The historical reality is less dramatic. The designer most responsible for the pyramid imagery was Charles Thomson, Secretary of Congress, who was not a Freemason. The Eye of Providence was in established use as a general Christian and Enlightenment symbol long before it acquired any particular Masonic association. The Freemasons adopted it. They did not originate it. Its presence on the seal most likely reflects Enlightenment religious symbolism rather than fraternal allegiance. The symbolism is nonetheless deliberate and layered. The 13 courses of stone represent the original 13 colonies. The number 13 recurs throughout the seal and the bill. 13 stars above the eagle on the right circle, 13 stripes on the eagle's shield, 13 arrows in the eagle's left talon, 13 leaves, and 13 berries on the olive branch in the eagle's right. The repetition is intentional, a persistent visual reference to the founding states. The pyramid is unfinished by design. The gap at the top, where the eye floats rather than a final stone being placed, is meant to suggest that the work of building the nation is not complete, that there is always more to be done, always another course of stone to lay. Above the eagle's head on the right circle, 13 stars are arranged in a formation that, examined closely, describes a six-pointed star, a Star of David. Whether this was intentional remains genuinely unclear from the historical record. It may be a coincidence of geometric arrangement, or it may be a deliberate reference. The people who designed the seal did not leave a definitive explanation. The eagle on the Great Seal holds 13 arrows in one talon and an olive branch in the other, symbols of war and peace. By tradition, the eagle is usually shown facing toward the olive branch, a visual statement that the nation prefers peace to war. This choice was deliberate and was the subject of discussion when the seal was first designed. The motto E pluribus unum, printed on the ribbon in the eagle's beak, means out of many, one. It served as the de facto national motto until Congress formally adopted In God We Trust in 1956. Both phrases now appear on current currency. The portrait on the $1 bill has been George Washington since 1869, more than a century and a half of the same face, printed billions of times, handled by generations of people who could not necessarily tell you anything specific about the first president, but could instantly recognize his likeness from across a room. The particular Washington portrait used on the dollar is based on a painting by Gilbert Stuart that Stuart never finished. The unfinished painting has become, in reproduced form, one of the most widely distributed images in human history. Other denominations carry their own faces. The $2 bill shows Thomas Jefferson, the 5, Abraham Lincoln, the 10, Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury and who played a central role in establishing the American financial system, though he was never president. The 20 shows Andrew Jackson, the 50, Ulysses S. Grant, the 100, Benjamin Franklin, who was also never president, but whose role in the founding of the country was considered sufficient to place him on the highest regularly circulating denomination. Even larger bills once existed. The $500 bill showed William McKinley. The $1,000 bill showed Grover Cleveland. The $5,000 bill showed James Madison. The $10,000 bill showed Salmon P. Chase, who was Secretary of the Treasury during the Civil War, and who, in an act of unusual self-promotion, placed his own likeness on the first $1 bill he oversaw the printing of. These higher denominations were used for transfers between banks rather than everyday commerce, and were officially discontinued in 1969 to discourage criminal use of large denomination cash. The $100,000 gold certificate, printed briefly in 1934, shows Woodrow Wilson. These notes were never used in public circulation. They were used only for transfers between Federal Reserve banks. A small number are preserved in museums. Privately owning one is illegal. Other currencies carry their own deliberate choices. The Euro banknotes, introduced in 2002, feature architectural imagery, windows, gateways, and bridges, chosen to be deliberately non-specific. The designs represent no actual building from any particular country. The architectural styles span different periods of European history, selected carefully to avoid favoring any member state. The bridges on the reverse sides of the notes were entirely invented by the designer. They look plausible. They evoke real European traditions, but they exist nowhere in the physical world. This caused an interesting problem. In 2011, a town in the Netherlands called Spijkenis built, at full scale, 7 of the bridges depicted on Euro banknotes. They are now actual bridges, spanning actual water, used by actual people, architectural fiction made physical, decades after the fact. The British pound note has carried the monarch's portrait since 1960, though for much of its earlier history it bore no portrait at all. The addition of the monarch's image served partly as a security measure, since a portrait is substantially harder to counterfeit convincingly than abstract design, and partly as an explicit statement of the relationship between the currency and the crown. The portrait updates when the monarch changes. The first notes featuring King Charles III began entering circulation in 2024, marking the first such change in more than 7 decades. Higher denomination Japanese yen notes feature the image of Fukuzawa Yukichi, a 19th century educator and writer regarded as a foundational figure in the development of modern Japan. The choice of an intellectual over a military figure or politician was deliberate, a statement expressed through currency design of what the country chose to value. Recent redesigns of Japanese currency continue this pattern, featuring scientists, educators, and entrepreneurs rather than political figures. The Australian $10 note features Mary Gilmore, a poet and journalist, alongside Banjo Patterson, another poet. The currency of a country that invented a new word for the space its first inhabitants used the bush to describe, carries poets on its money. The Norwegian krone features, on its reverse sides, abstract representations of wind and waves, designs so stylized that they abandon representational imagery entirely. The notes won international awards for currency design when they were introduced. They are among the most visually minimal banknotes in the world, and they were chosen partly to reflect Norway's relationship with the sea. Swiss francs feature portraits of cultural figures, architects, writers, scientists, artists, rather than political leaders. The designs have been praised for their complexity and security features, as well as their aesthetic choices. The Scottish pound note, issued not by the British government, but by 3 private Scottish banks, features, faces, and designs distinct from the Bank of England notes, despite being exchangeable at equivalent value. Northern Irish pound notes follow a similar pattern, issued by local banks rather than the central government. The British currency system is stranger than it appears to outsiders. And yet, for all the symbols printed on the surface, the most interesting things about a modern banknote are the things you cannot see at all without the right kind of light. A modern banknote functions as a layered security system. Every element of it, the substrate, the inks, the printing technique, the thread, the imagery, the watermark, is selected and engineered to make unauthorized reproduction as difficult as possible. And as printing technology has advanced, as scanners and printers capable of extraordinary reproduction have become cheaply available, the security features on banknotes have multiplied and become more technically demanding to replicate. The watermark is among the oldest security features still in active use. A watermark is formed during manufacturing by varying the thickness of the substrate itself. Not printed onto the surface, but built into the material. Held to the light, a shape becomes visible within the paper. The watermark on a $100 bill is a portrait of Benjamin Franklin, visible only when the note is backlit. It cannot be photocopied because a photocopier captures reflected light from a surface. It cannot reproduce variations in the thickness of paper itself. Watermarks have existed in European papermaking since the 13th century, originally used by individual mills to mark their products. Their use in banknotes began as soon as European banknotes began to exist. Hold any modern currency to a lamp and the watermark becomes visible, sometimes as a portrait, sometimes as a shape or symbol, always as an image that exists in the paper itself rather than on the paper. Color-shifting ink is a more recent development. On higher denomination US currency, certain printed elements shift in color when the note is tilted. The numeral in the lower right corner of a $100 bill appears green when viewed straight on and shifts to black when tilted. The effect is produced by metallic flake particles suspended in the ink, which reflect light differently depending on the angle at which they are viewed. The technology required to produce color-shifting ink is complex and expensive. The ink itself is controlled carefully, and access to it is limited. The $100 bill, redesigned in 2013, introduced an additional feature: a blue, three-dimensional security ribbon woven into the paper, not printed on it. Tilt the note, and the image on the ribbon appears to move. Bells become numbers. The pattern shifts. The ribbon is made of tiny lenses. Hundreds of thousands of microscopic lenses per square inch that focus light in different directions as the note is tilted. It is one of the most technologically advanced features ever incorporated into a banknote. Microprinting is a standard feature of virtually all modern currencies. Within designs that appear, to the unaided eye, as simple lines or decorative patterns, are words printed at a scale that requires magnification to read. On the US $100 bill, the words "The United States of America" are printed in minute letters along the lapel of Franklin's jacket. Without a magnifying glass, the letters appear simply as a slightly textured line. A photocopied note will reproduce the area as a blurred smear. Individual letters cannot be captured at that scale by standard copying equipment. Microprinting appears in multiple places on most modern banknotes, hidden in the border patterns, tucked into portraits, running along the numerals. On the American $100 bill, the words 100 USA are microprinted around the portrait in letters less than a millimeter tall. A genuine note carries these words cleanly. A counterfeit, attempting to reproduce them with standard equipment, produces only a smeared approximation. The security thread, as mentioned, glows under ultraviolet light, but UV light reveals other features as well. On many currencies, patterns invisible to the naked eye in ordinary light become clearly visible under UV. Patterns embedded in the paper or printed in fluorescent ink. These patterns are elaborate and distinctive. Reproducing them requires not only knowledge of their existence, but access to specific fluorescent inks and the printing equipment necessary to apply them correctly. The raised feel of intaglio printing is one of the most reliable quick tests for genuine currency. Run your fingernail lightly across the surface of a genuine note, and you can feel the slight ridges where the ink sits raised from the substrate. This tactile quality cannot be reproduced by standard printing methods, including the inkjet and laser printing available in most homes and offices. A counterfeit printed on an ordinary printer will feel flat. A genuine note will not. Banknote paper often includes invisible fibers, tiny red and blue threads mixed into the substrate during manufacturing, visible as small colored specks scattered across the surface of a note when examined closely. These fibers serve as a security feature, since counterfeiters attempting to replicate the effect by printing colored dots cannot easily match the three-dimensional appearance of actual fibers embedded in the paper. The modern banknote is, in short, a document so densely layered with security features that explaining them all would take longer than most people spend handling money in a lifetime. It is anti-counterfeiting engineering at a level of sophistication that exceeds the requirements of most classified government documents. The most sophisticated counterfeiting operations, those operating at a state level with access to industrial printing equipment, can sometimes reproduce individual security features convincingly. What they cannot consistently do is reproduce all of them simultaneously, because the combination of features on a modern note requires different equipment, different materials, and different expertise for each element. A note that passes under UV light might fail the field test. A note that feels right might have the wrong watermark. A note with correct microprinting might lack the color-shifting ink. The layering is deliberate. No single feature is relied upon, because any single feature might eventually be replicated by a determined adversary. Superdollars, the name given to exceptionally high-quality counterfeit US $100 bills that began appearing in the 1990s, are believed by US intelligence agencies to be produced by a specific state actor using industrial-grade equipment. They are reportedly so well made that they can fool most of the standard verification checks. They are, by some measures, the highest quality counterfeits ever produced at scale. They remain in circulation in small numbers around the world. Central bank digital currencies, money existing purely as information with no physical object, have been under development or pilot testing in a number of countries in recent years. China's digital yuan has been in active trial since 2020. Several other central banks are at various stages of development. These systems represent, in a structural sense, the logical continuation of the process that began when Tang Dynasty merchants exchanged paper receipts instead of copper coins. The progressive dematerialization of currency carried to its endpoint. The physical banknote has nonetheless persisted. It survived the introduction of the check. It survived the introduction of the credit card. It survived electronic transfers, contactless payment, cryptocurrency. In every era when physical currency appeared likely to become obsolete, it has not. People continue to carry it. People continue to prefer it in particular circumstances, for small purchases, for privacy, for moments when the infrastructure of electronic payment is unavailable. There is something specific about a physical banknote. Its weight, its texture, the particular smell of cotton and ink, the slight warmth it takes on from being carried close to a body, its anonymity, its immediacy. It requires no infrastructure, no signal, no charge device. It works in a power outage. It works in a place with no internet connection. It works between two people who share no account, no common platform, no prior relationship, and it carries, pressed into its surface in ink and thread and hidden light, the accumulated history of an agreement that is 1,000 years old. The first Tang Dynasty merchant who handed over a piece of paper and trusted that the person receiving it would honor what it represented. The engravers who spent months perfecting the portraits on banknote plates. The concentration camp prisoners who were forced to counterfeit British pounds under duress. The German families who burned worthless notes to stay warm. The cashier who holds a banknote up to the light to check the watermark, as cashiers have been doing in various forms for as long as paper money has existed. The note in your pocket carries all of that. And now the facts are settling. You know a little more than you did an hour ago about the cotton and linen, about the eye above the pyramid, about the bridges in the Netherlands that were built from pictures on money, about the thread that glows, colors you cannot see. The note is still there, in your wallet, probably, in a drawer somewhere, in a pocket you have not checked. You do not need to look at it now. The symbols are still there. The watermark is still waiting in the paper. The microprinting is still hidden in the portrait. The thread is still woven in, glowing in a color you cannot see without the right kind of light. Let them rest. Let the history rest. Let the room grow quieter now. This was the Sleepy Inventory. Good night.